In 1957, Jack Kerouac published his novel, On the Road. A famously wandering tale of adventure on the American roads, this book was originally meant to be even more freeform. Typed on one scroll over the course of 20 alcohol and drug-fueled days, On the Road was such a break from the norm that its author considered it the work of the Holy Ghost. In its final form, the book isn't quite as explicit or spontaneous as originally intended, but it still represents an immediate impression of post-war America that feels very different from Leave It to Beaver. This is the book that launched Jack Kerouac's career and solidified his position as a founding member and possibly the leading figure of the Beat movement. There's a lot to unpack in this book that meant so much to both of us in our younger years. So this is only the first of a two-part episode, something we've never done before. So pour yourself some Drambuie and scotch, and leave enough for next time as we embark on our discussion of Jack Kerouac and the Beats. It's time for episode 86 of Toasting the Classics, On the Road. Welcome to Toasting the Classics, the podcast where we take something that people call a classic and we drink something that's inspired by the classic, and then we talk about it, decide whether it's still a classic. My name is Dave McArthur.
And my name is Dr. Clint Lanier.
Doctor, I don't have that.
I could throw that in.
I can put some letters after my name, but I can't put any before it.
Every now and then we have a job opening. We get a application from a new, you can tell that they've just graduated, got their PhD because they call themselves Dr. So-and-so PhD.
Nice. Yeah.
Welcome to Toasting the Classics. What are we doing this week, Davey?
We are doing a book that I chose in a bout of apparently slightly tipsy choosing during one of the episodes.
Yeah.
I chose On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and that is a book that meant a lot to me as a kid. I haven't read it in a long time, but I used to take it with me on like every road trip when I was a young man. Mm-hmm. I probably read my old beat up orange Penguin copy of it like 6 times. But that's what came to the tip of my tongue when you asked me what book I was choosing, and so that's what we did.
That was it. When did you first read it?
That's a good question. I would say it was either my senior year of high school or my freshman year of college. I got it right around that time, and then read it again on my first cross-country road trip a year or two later, and then again on the next road trip that I went on. And I also went through some of the other Kerouac books. I remember having Dharma Bums, Big Sur, Desolation Angels, and they all blur together, to be perfectly honest. I don't know what's in what book. I learned a little bit more about it from doing the research for this episode. I remember Desolation Angels really stuck in my head. It's the one where he goes to the mountain peak. Yeah, and stays up there and does the fire watching thing for a couple of months. That one really stuck in my head, but otherwise it's just sort of a blur of a bunch of different stories that he tells. So how about you? What's your history with this book?
I can't tell you when I read it for the first time, to be honest with you, but I've read it many times since. I have it as an ebook that I had downloaded probably when I first got Kindle. So how long has Kindle been out?
A long time.
Yeah, my library, it's like at the bottom of the library. And it's just one that I would read probably like you. I mean, you read it like on an airplane or, something like that. And it's always one of those things that when you're traveling, or when you get a wild hair. When I wrote my book, Bucket List Bars, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when we did Denver, the Denver chapter, a couple of the places, and actually if you go to Denver, there were these stencils, and they're probably, I would say maybe 3-inch by 3-inch stencils that somebody had spray painted on locations that Kerouac had visited when he was in Denver.
Oh, very cool. That's very
cool.
And
you have to look for them. I mean, they would spray them like around the corner at the very like bottom, like to be very unobtrusive. So it's sort of like if you get them, it's kind of like geocaching.
Like I was just about to say that it's like geocaching.
Yeah, right. And so a couple of the bars that we visited have a Kerouac kind of history and legacy. One of them was Cassidy, not Kerouac. The other one is definitely Kerouac and Cassidy, but we can talk about that. So
Denver's definitely Cassidy country. I mean, that's like his whole childhood is in that city.
Right.
I always thought when it came to Denver, I read On the Road before I ever went to Denver. And when I went to Denver, I was disappointed. I was like, this is not the city he's talking about. Denver, Denver to me is just like this big suburb. I don't know. I love Colorado, and I like Denver because it's in Colorado and it gets me to Colorado. But the city itself is, I think, super mediocre. I've really never been a big fan of the city. Like, I've been to a ball game there. I've been to some breweries, things like that, but nothing you can't do in 100 other cities, basically.
I think you need to give Denver a bit more of a shake, an honest shake. As far as it's the downtown area is really where, and that's where all of this took place. That's where the bars were that he went to.
A lot of them still exist, the places that he mentioned?
Just one. Well, no, not places that he mentions, because he didn't use the real names, but places that they went to. there's really only
Mhm.
one. One closed during COVID, and the other's still there.
Okay.
And again, we can talk about the details first. Why don't you give us a summary okay, we've got maybe 5 listeners. There's one that might not have read this book. So how would
Right,
you
right.
summarize this book?
This book is broken up into 5 different books. Now we can summarize. Really, the writing of the book is definitely worth talking about in some
Yes.
detail, as well as just a synopsis of the plot, because the plot is thin. The plot is autobiographical details, basically, strings
Yeah.
of anecdotes, which definitely have a narrative.
Mhm.
But in terms of a plot, there really isn't much of a plot. It circles around his obsession with this one guy, Neil Cassidy. And by the way, I want to make this parenthetical statement. I read the original scroll for the first time in my
Mm.
life
Oh, okay.
doing for doing this show. So on the tip of my tongue are all the proper names of the people: Allen
Oh,
Ginsberg, Neil
interesting. Yeah.
Cassidy,
Okay.
William S. Burroughs. They're all referred to by their actual names in the
Yeah.
scroll. So I can't even remember. I was trying to remember what is Allen Ginsberg is like Carlo Marx or something like that.
Yeah, that's Carlo Marx. Bull Lee is Burroughs.
That one, yeah, I remember that. And
Um,
then Dean Moriarty and
Dean
Sal
Moriarty
Paradise.
is and
Yeah.
Sal Paradise. Yeah.
The scroll is like a Romana clay. It's the actual characters. You're actually hearing
Mm.
what did Allen Ginsberg do on this particular night and things like
Yeah.
that, which is, I think, better. But I can see why he didn't do it in a lot of ways,
Sure.
because they do things. There's one scene where Neil and Jack Kerouac steal a car
Yeah.
and then escape from Denver just in time to not get arrested for stealing the car. And
Right.
I was thinking, he released the book like 8 years later. You could still be arrested for stealing a car 8 years
Yeah.
later
I
if
don't
the
know. It depends on the statute of limitations that
it
Burroughs
depends on the statute
sort
of
of figured
limitations,
out.
but something
Yeah.
like a felony, I think the statute of limitations might be, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't bother, but you'd be taking a risk, let's just say.
Right. Sure.
So
So basically, but the gist of the book is that you've got a guy living in New York City, and that's
right.
Kerouac. It's autobiographical. Kerouac keeps moving west on these. Was there 4 road trips or 3 road trips? I can't remember.
There's 5 books, and I would
But so,
say 4 definite road trips, and the
some
fifth
of them take place
fifth
coming
book is
back
not really.
though.
Yeah, some
Yeah.
of them are return trips, right? But
But I think he went. I think he went west 3 times, if I remember correctly. Maybe 4,
it
3
depends on whether you count the Mexico trip, because there's the trip where they go
to
down
Mexico.
from.
Would that be 4?
I think
Because they went to Denver and
that's
then down.
that's the 4th book. Yeah, so
Okay.
I think a trip from Denver to Mexico City is a little different than a cross country
Okay.
American road trip, but it's definitely a big road trip. There's no
But he
question.
went west, and there's this thing about movement east to west, and about a contrast in a different America, or a
Uh,
different place, So it's about these different experiences, road trips, basically, and yeah, they all somehow revolve around Neil Cassidy or this guy named, I just lost it,
Dean Moriarty in the
Dean
original.
Moriarty, yeah, Dean Moriarty, which is his name in the book.
I should say original publication. The scroll
Yeah,
was the original
right,
writing.
right, that's right,
The publication that came out, it's 57, right? Is the original
correct, yeah,
publication date?
57, that's
Yeah,
right,
so the
yeah,
57 book that's published is very different from what I read. Although
yeah.
it's all the same stories.
Yeah,
There's some different things that happen.
they cut out a lot of the graphic sexual
Yeah,
stuff. And
it's not too bad. I wouldn't say it's graphic. It's
by
just
today's
explicit.
standards, yeah, by today's standards, sure.
It's just explicit, and I mean by explicit what I mean is it's an explicit statement that somebody's having sex. It's
Right.
really not graphic at all.
Yeah.
There's really not anything like that would count as dirty by anybody's standards today. It's just literally like, instead of hinting that Neil might have had sex with the guy, he's like, Neil had sex with this guy. But
Yeah.
that's the end. It's really not it's really
and
not
you've
graphic.
got a lot of things working against you there, because you've got premarital sex, extramarital sex, and you've got homosexual
Gay. Yeah, there's a lot of
gay sex,
exactly.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that you got to cut out for sense of decency back then. But yeah, and so there's this Neil Cassidy was a friend of Jack Kerouac's, he was a friend of all the beats, really, and we'll get into that in a second. But he meets Neil in New York City and decides to go west to go find him. He knows that he's in Denver, so he goes to Denver, and then he just kind of keeps moving west, ends up in San Francisco and then LA, and then comes back on that trip. And then on another trip, Neil comes over to visit him, and then they go back together. It does involve Neil, but it's sort of the same cast of characters. And
Yeah.
through these kind of tales like you just told, like they steal a car, or they steal this or steal that. They somehow bum money off of people, but they never have any money. They're always getting drunk and getting drugs,
There's a
drinking a
lot of
lot.
bar
And,
hopping for people that don't have money. He had
I know,
$50.
which
He had
we'll talk
$50
about.
to cross the whole country. When he started his first trip, he had $50 his mother gave him to cross. Sorry, in the book, I think in the
Yeah,
original book, it's his aunt, right?
yeah, it's his aunt, but in real life, it's his mom,
It's his
Gabrielle.
mother. In the
Yeah,
scroll, it's his mother explicitly.
yeah,
So he has $50 across the whole country, which I saw somewhere is like $600 today. And I was
right.
thinking, I could get across America on $600, but I would not be doing any bar hopping along the way.
Right.
I would be like
Right.
eating sandwiches and paying for gas, and that would be about it. Like
Yeah.
that would
Yeah.
get you across the country and nothing else.
But I think, I think it might have been possible that at that time, hitchhiking was, again, it was a different time. I mean, people would pick up other people on the side of the road and
Right.
you always hear about, well, when I was a kid, we didn't have to lock our doors. And that was the kind of environment that he was doing this in. I mean, they were the first class of scoundrels, really.
There's a connection there that's really interesting to me that just occurred to me right now is that a lot of people attribute America's awareness and fear of crime to the book In Cold Blood,
Yes.
which is like,
Yeah.
a contemporary of this book, almost the same time those two books came out.
Yeah.
Truman Capote is the guy who said that Kerouac wasn't writing, it was just
He was
typing.
Yeah.
Which
Right.
is very unfair. There are some other critiques of the book that I thought made a lot more sense, but that one I was like, come on, you're just jealous. I mean,
Yeah.
Truman Capote's a great writer, but he's a more traditional style of writer.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But the two books are very similar. If you read In Cold Blood, I mean, it's the road trip narrative of Dick and Perry is very much like what's going on with. It's like an outsider looking at what Jack and Neil are like. But
and so, but what happens is that's what America becomes. But when they were, because he was actually doing this between 51 and 54 was when this was taking place. He published it in 57.
It happened earlier. It happened 47 through 49.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. Yes, you're right.
He wrote the book.
He wrote it in 51. My
Wrote
apologies.
it in April. Yeah, the sitting
51.
down and creating the scroll is, I think, a 20-day period. Did you say 51?
I think it was 51.
I think it's April of 1951 is when he sat down and wrote.
That's right.
All the stories are actually taking place, and that's in the back of my mind. I can't help always thinking World War II doesn't get mentioned as much as you would think, considering it just ended. And it's the central fact of everybody's life. It's weird how little they talk about it.
Yeah.
Everybody, what did Neil do during the war? Was he not in the, maybe he was too young.
I think he was in jail.
Oh, that's
probably in jail.
Yeah, that's right.
He was a felon, I mean, he'd gone to state pen and everything else. So
yeah, that's right. They don't let you fight if you're, unless you're Russian, you don't conscript people who are.
If you're Russian, you go to the front line and sorry, mate. Like I said, they were the first class of sort of scoundrels that would do this sort of thing. I remember watching a Mayberry. What's that show? Oh, the Andy Griffith Show.
Andy Griffith Show.
Yeah. And so, that was set in the 50s. I think it actually came out in the 60s, but it was sort of hailing to the 50s. And that was a sort of town that Mayberry, like South Carolina or something like that, sort of place where you don't lock your
North Carolina.
Oh, North Carolina. So you don't lock your doors. And
my great aunt lived near the town that Mayberry is based on, and I think it's Mount Airy, North Carolina, if I remember right. But maybe not. Anyway, the whole town has a cottage industry of like
I'm sure, Mayberry. But that was the kind of place where you don't lock your doors and all this other stuff. And there was an episode where a tramp moves into town. And Andy Griffith's job was sort of to shoo the tramp away. Like, we don't like your kind here. And he was doing those sort of hijinks that tramps would do. Like, he would steal an apple pie from the windowsill, and Aunt B would be like, "Where's my apple pie? I just put it here." And he would steal laundry and stuff like that. And then, Opie would go down and, he gave me some apple pie, and he was wearing a shirt that looked just like yours. And so that was the kind of people that the ne'er-do-wells, but you didn't have people that were like thieving, like we're stealing cars and doing this kind of stuff.
This is some more serious crime. And he talks about, it's weird because he talks about people like that. He talks about tramps as being other, and he talks about hipsters. And I don't know what he means by hipsters. I don't know who he's talking about. Obviously, a hipster owns a loft in Williamsburg and makes his own cottage mead. That's what a hipster is. in 2023. That's
Right.
not what he's talking
Right.
about.
Yeah.
I was trying to get the sense of what he meant by that word. And also he refers to gay people by dropping F-bombs all the time, talking about them.
Yeah.
And I thought that was strange considering that most of the people he hangs out with are gay. So what does he mean by that word too?
I mean, I don't know. Was it derogatory? I mean, at the time, it
I
became.
don't, not like it is today, but it's a class of person that's different than him. You could tell he's othering the
Yeah.
people by calling them that word. And
Mhm.
I don't know what he means. Maybe he just means they're very effeminate. Maybe it's not
I
about
don't,
being
you know,
sexual. It's about
it might not be that he's othering people, that he's doing it. I think he's using the othering term that everybody else uses for him, maybe.
no. He's definitely
No.
the guy that they meet that gives them a ride, and Neil is
Oh,
like
yeah,
he
yeah, yeah.
propositions him and Neil, and he definitely refers to that guy in a derogatory fashion as being a
Yeah.
an F,
Oh, I think,
and
maybe it
it's
has something to do with like a lech or something, because that's all that guy was
maybe
wanting
yeah,
versus because Carlo Marx is, and he alludes to it throughout,
right,
is gay. He never
yeah.
talks about him that way either.
I saw an interview by Allen Ginsberg talking about Kerouac.
Uh-huh.
And he's talking about this TV interview that Kerouac did, where he keeps mixing up the guy's name, Jablonski, and calling him Abramowitz. And the
Uh-huh.
guy's like, what oh, I guess you're anti-Semitic. And Allen Ginsberg's like, oh, he got accused of being anti-Semitic, which he was. And I'm like, well, like, what you guys are friends. It's so it's a weird
we could
thing
all
going
we
on.
could all get along, I guess. No,
Yeah,
it's
maybe he saw Allen Ginsberg as being like one of the good ones, like
that's sort of what I was
I
thinking.
have lots of gay
I
friends.
think there's the in crowd, like, I hate gay people, but you're okay.
Right.
I'm not talking
Right.
about you, like
Exactly.
my grandparents would, that's something like a grandma would do. Like, oh, I hate these type of people. Not them though, because they're okay.
Oh, I think I told this anecdote before, but my grandfather would always say, he'd be like, "Oh, I have this client. He's black, but he's nice." And I always thought my grandfather was like being really racist saying that. But I realized years later it was because my grandmother was so bigoted that if my
Yeah,
grandfather mentioned someone black, she'd have a conniption
yeah.
fit about it. So he'd always be like, "No, no,
Well,
this guy's really nice. Trust me." Like,
my grandma would differentiate between Mexicans and Spanish people, and so Regina's parents were a really nice Spanish family, and then she couldn't stand these Mexican people down the street, type of thing. And it's like,
right,
okay,
right.
grandma,
Yeah, the
Anyway,
arbitrary classifications.
yeah,
Exactly. That's what I mean. That's what it sounds like to me. Him using that
yeah.
word about some people, but hanging
Also,
out
though,
with gay
I
guys
think
all
there's
the
a
time.
bit of in the time type of terminology that we might not have. And he was also, they were also really big into jazz and to sort of this
Yeah,
underground jazz scene. And I think
yeah,
so, dig it and hip and these types
right.
of words. I think a lot of that comes from that, because those weren't commonplace. Hipsters and hip and that kind of stuff, they weren't commonplace terms, I don't think, unless you're sort of in that crowd, the sort of jazz crowd that they were in. And they were like into real jazz, not the
Oh
white
yeah.
big band jazz. They were like,
Well, they were somewhere between Charlie Parker's ornithology period and Miles Davis, right?
right, which is explained to
They
us.
were
Yeah.
local. Speaking of really cool crowds, I think we should
Mhm.
talk about what we're drinking, which is a
Oh,
drink
okay.
that was
God.
imbibed by a pretty cool crowd. I didn't know this. I picked it because I knew Jack Kerouac liked it. But
Mhm.
apparently, this is the Rusty Nail, and apparently, it
Yeah.
was a favorite of the Rat Pack. Apparently, it was associated with Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. And who's in the Rat Pack? I'm
Okay.
trying to
So
think.
Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin.
Uh, Dean Martin, right?
Yeah, Dean Martin. Those are the main three guys. And you had people
Yeah,
like Joey Lawrence or Joey Bishop, one of the two.
it
Yeah,
can't be
Joey
Joey.
Bishop.
Whoa,
Yeah.
it's
Whoa.
definitely
No,
not Joey Lawrence.
Joey Bishop, is that the guy's name?
I don't know.
Um,
I don't think I've ever engaged with anything Rat Pack. Somehow that's just missing from my cultural education. I
huh.
can't think of what would I is it are they in movies together? They were in
Well,
the original Ocean's 11, right?
Ocean's 11. Yeah, that's where
Okay,
it
so if
sort
I
of comes
watched the
from.
original
Yeah.
one, if I watched that, maybe that would be an interesting thing to do for the show. Actually, I
I
mean,
think
I've seen.
they called themselves the Rat Pack.
Okay,
Because they like during the filming of Ocean's 11, what they did was they would film it, and they would actually perform at the Sands or something.
okay,
And so you'd be able to see Dean Martin, those three, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Sinatra perform together. And there's a few surviving YouTube videos of it. And they would just sort of do this ad lib comedy thing. And they'd make fun of each other. Like I remember one time Frank Sinatra goes to a table and picks up like this huge vase off the middle of the table. And he
Mm.
says, "Oh, Mr. Martin, your drink's here."
Oh
Making
yeah,
fun of him for being a drunk or
nice.
something, and everybody laughs at him and stuff like that. And
Like a live
just
podcast.
yeah, one of the funniest was when there was a scene. There, for some reason, Sammy Davis Jr. leaps into, I can't remember if it's Dean Martin's arms or Frank Sinatra's arms or something like that. Everybody laughs at that, and without batting an eye, whoever he's is holding him is says, "I'd like to thank the NAACP for this award." He holds up.
Oh,
Anyway,
that's pretty good. I like that's a good
okay,
one.
so the Rusty Nail, I didn't realize. So it was created about in the 1960s, apparently, in New York City. Well, 1935 was another date that
Yeah.
I read, but it's not very old.
It
It's a
started being called
cocktail.
the Rusty Nail, definitely, yeah, in the 60s, I think.
Yeah, but it's from sort of the cocktail days. You'd have like a brandy royal and things like that. It's 1.5 ounces of scotch, 3/4 ounce of drambuie, and a
Okay.
dash of bitters.
So
So
basically a dash of bitters. I don't have bitters. Darn it. I didn't catch that. I have a whole bunch of bitters. It's all in storage. I have a box of like really good stuff that's
you
we're
need
gonna get
bitters.
later. But I'm going with a 2-to-1 ratio, which is I think what you just said also.
Yep.
Apparently you can kind of vary it. But I've never had Drambuie before, and it was not super easy to find in New York. I went
Really,
to
that's interesting.
I think it was okay. Let me put it this way. But by not easy
Oh,
to find in New York,
bodega. Yeah.
I had
Yeah,
to go.
bodega.
No, no, I went to liquor stores. I went to four
Okay.
different liquor stores asking for Drambuie. One of them, I had to speak Spanish. The lady just was staring at me like, "What are you talking about?" I had to just,
Donde
ask her.
está Drambuie?
I had to go to the fourth place. And when I say hard to find in New York, what I mean is I had to go to 4 liquor stores, but of course there are 4 liquor stores within a 4 block radius. It just took
Oh,
me some
well.
time. It
Yeah.
really wasn't that difficult.
Took you some walking to do. Yeah.
Why don't you, as the historian of alcohol, tell us a little bit about Drambuie?
Drambuie is interesting. So they think created about the 18th century for Bonnie Prince, whatever his name was.
That's the
Um,
legend, right? That's interesting.
yeah, that's
Bonnie
the
Prince,
legend.
Charles Edward Stewart.
That's right. And so
Ooh,
really, it's just
I, all I taste is scotch. Did I
it's
do that wrong? Oh, wait a minute. I forgot. Look, I actually have a nail
you actually have a nail to
because
drop in there.
some people think that the reason it's called a rusty nail is because you stir it with a rusty nail. I don't think
Uh,
there's much backing for that.
I
And
don't know where it
I
comes
don't
from.
actually keep rusty nails in my house, so I just have a
Yeah.
nail, like regular galvanized, bright, common nails. So I'm stirring. Sorry, I cut you off. I wanted to mention that I'm stirring my drink with a nail.
Nice, nice. It's a secret recipe, one of those things. It's just kind of an industrial recipe, but it's just scotch, honey, and some spices. So if
Okay.
you drink it by itself, it's really close to Grand Marnier.
What is Grand Marnier?
So that's brandy. It's a brandy based liqueur, but it's
Okay.
very
So
similar to it. Yeah.
Drambuie, according to the history that I looked at, was
Mhm.
originally brandy and then was changed to be Scotch as the base for it.
Uh,
It pretty much would have been Grand Marnier, and then they
I
changed it.
didn't I didn't read
That's what
that at
makes it.
all. They might mean that there existed a brandy and honey because it was sort of a medicinal. I mean, it would revive you. Supposedly, the prince would take a few drops every day or whatever. And this is back when people were lucky enough to think of alcohol as medicine instead of a poison like today.
No, I
So
it,
it
the
might have
legend.
it might have been that, hey, this brandy and honey are really good for you. Well, they're in Scotland, so they don't have brandy. And actually, even in England at that time, they wouldn't have brandy because there's an embargo on it. So they would use the next best thing, which was Scotch. So Scotch and honey. I mean, that might be. You never know.
That was something about the story of Scotch, right? That we talked about early in the show, where they used brandy casks because they had brandy casks laying around after an embargo or something like that. That's why they
The English were at war with the French many, many
right
times, and so they couldn't get
always
brandy. Brandy was the spirit of choice for the upper crust in
right.
England for the longest time. And when they couldn't get it any longer, they sort of switched to Scotch whiskey, which was being made from the 16th century on. So that became sort of their poison of choice, so to speak, until they started making gin, and then all hell broke loose.
So this is going to be a pretty strong drink, I would think. We got
You
a
got Scotch on Scotch. You got
yeah.
Scotch
I mean,
mixed
the
with honey
Drambuie
on
is
Scotch.
Drambuie's what? What kind of proof are we talking? 40%, right? So 80.
40%. Is that Drambuie's 40%?
I can't remember if it was 40% or 40 proof. I wish they didn't have those two things. I know the difference,
Let's
but I
see.
can't remember which number I read. but I think it's about the same proof as the scotch itself. So I think you're pretty much just drinking I poured myself a pretty good
Yeah.
pour with the
Yeah.
proportions of pretty
Yeah.
much.
As did I. It's 80 proof. Well, I think that's what sort of why it's called a rusty nail. It's not a
Okay.
sweet cocktail. It's not super sweet.
It's not.
It
No,
has a,
not at
it
all.
has a hint of, I mean, you're pouring sweetened scotch into scotch, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So you just get slightly less sweetened scotch.
Right. Yeah. So you're watering down that sweetened scotch by a ratio of 2 to 1, as you mentioned. The bitters do spring it a little bit. They open it up a bit, so it's not as scotchy as that. And I mean, if you were drinking a pretty low class scotch, like not very smooth, which you can get pretty easily, like Clan McGregor or one of those, I can
I
see it
got
being.
doers.
I think rusty nail might be a good description of it, right? Ugh,
Yeah, it could be.
you know.
Yeah, I have doers. I didn't want to. I had like the last little bit of a bottle of Macallan, and I'm like, I'm not going to waste that on
Yeah.
mixing
Yeah.
something.
Good.
So I
Good.
decided to go ahead and get a $20. I don't remember what you call these, but 375 milliliter bottle of doers. But
That's probably all you need. Yeah. I will say this just to clarify. Kerouac drank everything. He drank
yeah,
everything he could.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
And so many different drinks get a mention
yeah.
in this book.
Right.
So we could have done anything. I just happened to find an article that talked about him drinking rusty nails. So I
Yeah.
figured, oh, I've never had that. Let's give that a shot.
Sure. Yeah.
So, oh, the one thing I didn't mention about Drambuie is so Drambuie means a drink that satisfies.
Right.
And I realized, and it's Gaelic, and I realized, oh, dram. I actually know that word for a drink. That's actually
Right.
like a word that came over to English. So
A
that's kind of an
dram.
easy way.
Yeah. As a
I
measurement.
was kind
Yeah.
of surprised. I was surprised to find that's Gaelic. I didn't know what Drambuie was at all. I had no
Mhm.
conception of what it was. This is my total first experience with it, which is pretty cool. I like
Which is, it's not bad. I mean, it's
it a
by
bit.
itself. There are a lot of recipes that have drambuie that are much better than a rusty nail, which is
Okay.
admittedly very, very simple. But there's some that you mix cream with it since it's a sweet drink and makes really good mixed drinks.
We were talking about the crowd that they hung out with and how much they like jazz. What that kind of brings me to thinking about is the style of the book, which is very, I think, innovative. I don't think there's anything really like this quite before. And the way that he got to it is really interesting because he had all these notes. They took all the trips for a couple of years, and he had all these notes to put together a book, which I would say would be a very traditional format for a novel about
Right.
two guys going across the country and having some of the same themes and metaphors and things that end up being in the main book, but it was a
Hmm.
lot less autobiographical. So he was working on writing the book as a
Hmm.
traditional novel, and it sounded dull. It sounded like something I wouldn't have been interested in. Like maybe
Right.
you would read it, but it just, Truman Capote's book uses some of these same road trips and things like that, but it happens to be a much more interesting story underneath.
Hmm. Right.
But what ended up happening is actually Neil Cassidy. Neil Cassidy sat down and wrote a 45-page, essentially like this style, just like a free verse thing, just talking about not is it stream of consciousness? Would you say this is stream of consciousness? Not quite, right? That's like
Mm.
Faulkner. This is a little different than that. There is some structure and some plot to it, and there's punctuation and stuff like that. But it's very free and it's very impressionistic version of English prose. So he
Mm.
wrote this 45-page letter talking basically about all the girls he'd ever hooked up with.
Mm.
And he sent it to Kerouac. Kerouac read it and was so inspired that he wrote a letter back to Neil Cassidy in this style. And then very soon afterwards sat down and just wrote this book in the
Mhm.
course of what we said, like 20 days, writing 6,000 words a day, and then even more, maybe 10,000 words a day for how many pages would that be? It's like 300. So like, that's like 20 pages a day, ramping up to more like 30 or 40 pages a day.
Mhm.
Which is a pretty good clip, if you ask me, as
Yeah,
someone who
absolutely.
has, but this kind of writing, I think I could do this kind of writing for 20 pages a day because
Yeah.
it's just less crafted, if you know what I mean. If you were in the right zone. Did you try listening to some of the music that gets mentioned?
Mm-mm. No, I didn't. Did you?
Yeah, I put on a whole bunch of it, like while I was reading and then while I was
Ah.
putting my notes together. I actually had this moment right before we got online together. I had this moment. I actually ended up with a lot of notes about this because it's just an
Mhm.
interesting subject to me. And I had a moment where I was like, I should have cut the margins off of the pages, gotten some tape, and taped together my notes into a big
Right.
long. And then I realized that would be impossible to work with while I was
Sure.
sitting.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm much
Yeah.
more practical, I guess, than these artistic types. But
Well, it's easier. It's easier, I guess, if you're typing. I mean, he had so there's no paragraph breaks, no margins on the scroll.
right.
Can you imagine being the editor of this thing?
Oh, nightmare. Yeah,
I
nightmare.
mean, yeah, I have this book.
But
Here's a scroll.
yeah. Well, there was this whole story about how he showed up at what's the guy's name? Giraud? Robert Giraud, I think, was the guy who was the publisher who had
Yeah.
dealt with the town and the city, his
Yeah.
first.
hmm
And he shows up at his house and he gives him this scroll and he tells him it's been written by the Holy Ghost. And basically the guy was like, yeah, there's great writing in here, but we really need to edit it a ton and we need to do a
Yeah.
lot with this and change it. And
Yeah.
he told him he had offended the Holy Ghost and he stormed off and he ended up leaving the scroll with the guy. And the end of my book 5, cuts off, and essentially the guy's dog ate the last part of the scroll.
Oh wow.
So this version of the book I have, this version of the scroll, they actually went back and recreated with a bunch of marginalia and stuff like that.
hmm
And the final version, the 57 version of the novel is published, and they tried to recreate what had been on the last few pages of the scroll. That the dog chewed up, which I don't, is that where that archetype comes from? The trope of the dog eating your homework?
Maybe I don't know. That's terrible.
It's hard to imagine, but yeah. So basically, that whole process of sitting down and writing the whole thing, I think that's a big part of the mythos of the book.
hmm
Had you
hmm
heard of all that before? The whole scroll
Oh
process
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I
yeah,
mean, probably not when I first read it, but I mean, as a literature major, you learn about these things in
yeah,
American Lit and stuff like that. So I'm sure I learned it somewhere. I don't know where I learned it from, but I know that the owner of the Colts owns the original
yeah,
scroll.
yeah. That's crazy. I saw that.
He
So
bought
he
it for
paid
like 2.8 million or something.
2.3 million for it to
2.3
own it,
million. And
which is
it'll probably go for a lot more if he wanted to sell it to the
that's
Smithsonian or
what I
something like
was
that.
that's what I was thinking. I was thinking he bought it, right? And that seems strange, right? The kind of guy who owns the Colts. Is that guy really a big literature fan? That seems
But
very
you know
weird.
what?
But he probably bought it as an investment, like
Maybe,
just to own the piece of art.
but I will say this for him. It actually went on traveling display, and it went
Hmm?
throughout Europe and England and in the US, and it went to like I think the Smithsonian, and it went to various museums and so forth. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
good for him. I mean,
Yeah.
it's because there are plenty of millionaires that buy things and then hide them. Put them on their
Oh,
yacht or something, and nobody ever
oh, yeah.
sees them again. But good for him to buy it and then display it. So cool.
I was just reading this whole, I can't remember if it was New Yorker or New York Times, but I was just reading this whole article about this one family that would literally go out and buy every single work of art by somebody. Like they
hmm
cornered everything David Hockney had ever done that they could possibly get their hands on
hmm
just to hold on to it long enough to raise the price on David Hockney and make him seem like a really hot commodity. And then so
Yeah.
that just, wow. Yeah. That's
They
not
could
what art
sell so
should
they could
be.
dump it all. Yeah. I'm doing that with
Yeah.
Hunter Biden's actually. So yeah.
Is he an artist of some kind?
Hunter Biden? Oh, he's a hugely famous artist. Absolutely.
I don't know. All I know is he does a lot of crack or whatever, but I don't really know anything. This maybe I'm just a Philistine. Maybe I'm just a really dumb guy. But to me, the art market, the whole thing seems like the emperor's clothes. I mean, it just seems a
Mhm.
lot of the time like people are buying stuff and you're like, how do you know this is any good? I
Yeah.
mean,
Right.
could I see some value in having a Mark Rothko on my wall? Yeah, because it's Mark Rothko. I could tell people,
Yeah.
hey, this is a Mark Rothko, but you don't look at that and it does anything for you.
Right.
And
Right.
to bring it back to the book that we're talking about, I saw a quote from, and I don't remember if he said it in the text of the book. You can let me know if it's in there because obviously you would recognize it too. But he said something about how if you can't take a piece of art and give it to a common person and have them understand it and enjoy it on some level, that's a dead art. And I was thinking I think I've always thought that and I've never quite expressed it that way because I was always impressed. I think I might have told you the story one time, but when I lived in New Orleans, I lived next to a performing arts high school and you used to see these little kids walking down the street playing their trombone and their trumpet and like playing jazz together. And then you'd
Mhm.
go to the bars and there'd actually be like a 25-year-old guy on stage playing jazz. And I
Mhm.
was thinking, in New Orleans, this is a living art form. Like
Mhm.
people are doing this, and it's for the regular young people are doing it. And
Mhm.
that to me is a living art form. And it's the same with anything that people can't really, if you write a novel and it's unintelligible to like 99% of people, it's really only
Mhm.
for people in academia or something. That's
Yeah.
not, that's art, but it's not a living art. It's like something that has
Yeah,
lost,
I don't
it's
know.
lost its
There's
vitality.
that's certainly interesting debate, and I've struggled with that myself. I had a moment of existential crisis when I was at a university one time. You know, there's this whole rush to get tenure when you're an academic. So, which I'm up for tenure now, and so kind of I can appreciate it. But I've left two previous tenure track jobs before getting tenure.
I'm looking forward to you getting tenure just so we can actually
Okay.
hear what you really think on these podcasts.
Well, you know it's going to happen, absolutely.
So you stop
But
self-censoring.
at the end of every academic year, you have to like list all the publications that you wrote for that year, blah blah blah,
Right.
and you do have a specific number. Like you have to have before you can go up for tenure, you might have to have 5 peer-reviewed journal articles or something like that. So it's a real this rush for tenure is a real thing. And my crisis came when I realized like I spent all this time doing a study and writing this journal article and submitting it to the journal and getting feedback from the peer review and revising it and everything else. And so it took me like 6 months to do the research. It took me maybe another 6 or 7 or 8 months for the writing process. And then it was published like a half year later. So a year and a half later
Yeah.
from when I started this thing, all this work. And I realized it's a super obscure journal. It's really
Yeah.
for only one discipline, and there might be 20 people that actually read this article. It's pretty depressing if you think about it that way.
But the purpose of well, if what was your thesis about?
Oh, it wasn't a thesis; it was a research article, but it
Oh,
was
well,
some research,
whatever.
some
But I mean,
research study that I did.
but I guess what I mean, what I was going to say is that the purpose of that is not necessarily art. The purpose
Mhm.
of that is hopefully to push forward the boundaries of some scholarly discipline, you know.
Right.
So if it's only 20 people, you know, like when Einstein wrote his papers you know, when he wrote his paper on special relativity, there were very few people could understand it, but it was still important
That's
because
true. But
it was
see,
pushing forward
but
the boundaries of
he
something.
wasn't writing it. He wasn't writing it for this process or machinery.
No, right. Yeah.
In my case, I was writing it for a process of tenure. I mean, that's really the only
Right.
reason I sort of did this, and
Right.
nobody would really care about it. Nobody would really care about it, but I checked the box. And I guess what I'm doing is I'm drawing similarities to an artist who is doing it for an industry or for a machine, and
Right.
nobody really cares about it. Nobody really appreciates it. Nobody really wants it. But
Yeah, I
um,
guess what you're describing is like the academic version of paintings that are going to be hung on the wall at Denny's or in a hotel or something.
maybe so, yeah, maybe so.
They have to be there. There has to be a picture.
Yeah,
It'd be weird if
absolutely,
there wasn't,
yeah,
but you know, nobody's going to be holding a, you know, a
yeah.
symposium talking about the
Well, you know, and interestingly enough, this happens in literature all the time. I mean, this book was hugely impactful, but it was impactful because the art world, like the intellectuals, glommed onto it, right?
Mhm.
This isn't, you know, people. I would say that outside of his league of friends, maybe 5 or 6 people,
Uh-huh.
nobody else he interacted with in the book would ever read it. Like the cotton, like
Oh,
the
yeah.
Mexican girl
Gucci.
in
Oh.
Los Angeles. You know, like what do we
Do you
call
think
what to
she's
call them?
real?
Probably, yeah, probably
I
so.
had this weird impression. And the only reason I always thought that was sort of an invented episode, but the reason I sort of thought it was real is because when in the scroll, her name is
Mm,
Beatrice.
mm,
And in the book, he changes her name. And I was thinking he wouldn't have changed her name if it wasn't a real
right,
person.
right.
I always thought that part sounded like some kind of weird fantasy he had about hooking up with a Mexican girl. And
Yeah,
there was some aspect of it that felt untrue to me, but I don't know. Maybe I was wrong about that. Sorry, that was a
yeah.
parenthetical. You were
No, no, no,
talking
no,
about,
no. It's fine. No,
but yeah,
my
right.
point
A
is
lot of
that
the
like
people he interacts with, a lot of the
would
people he
never read
interacts
this.
with
Yeah,
are just kind of salt of the earth, regular
right.
people. I think that's what infatuated these people with Neil Cassidy so much is that he bridged the gap between those two worlds
Yeah,
because he's
yeah. Me
very,
too.
you know, he's like a felon and like a guy off the street. He's like borderline
Mhm.
illiterate, but
Yeah,
also very smart and can run in
yeah.
these circles of intellectuals. And I think that was, and Kerouac, I think, has an image of being kind of that guy too, because he's a little bit more between the worlds than some of the other guys,
Mhm.
but definitely an intellectual and has a pedigree. I mean, he was at Columbia University and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
he's
Well,
not salt of the earth, you know.
well, no, he had blue collar roots, so
He had blue collar roots. Yeah, that's
for
true.
sure. And you know, and the reason he got to Columbia was for the football scholarship. So I
That's
mean,
right. That's right.
um, and he had to leave once he broke his leg. So, I mean,
He didn't. No, he didn't
um,
have to leave. He broke his
yeah, he
leg.
chose to
He broke
leave.
his leg,
Yeah,
and he dropped out of school in a peak. Like he got so
yeah,
angry, he just left
with a,
school and quit and
with a
decided to
coach.
be a
Yeah.
writer.
If you look at a novel, though, pick up any novel off of your bookshelf, 99.99% chance it won't be written in this style.
No,
It'll be written in
not
the
a lot of
traditional
them.
style, right? So
The only thing
this
I've
was,
ever the Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs is about the only thing I've ever read. Because even Hunter S. Thompson, the prose is way more structured than this. I
yeah,
thought maybe I don't know. Am I remembering it wrong? I feel like it was a lot more structured than this was, but it's similar. It's definitely related
yeah,
to it in ways. And
yeah.
they ended up, I guess, there ended up being sort of a fracture within the community of what's the overall counterculture type
Mm-hmm.
writers,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's Kerouac's group, and then there was Ken Kesey
Mm-hmm.
later. And
Yeah,
actually, weirdly enough, through Neil Cassady and Ken Kesey started hanging out, and that sort of started that wave of guys that were more like in the early '60s.
right.
Uh, and Kerouac just couldn't get along with those guys, and he had nothing to do with them. He
Yeah.
was very, very different than them. He was more traditional, and I think probably most importantly, was about 5 years older than they were. And he was
Well, I
sensitive
think,
about it. There's a couple of parts in the book where he gets really sensitive about his age relative to Neil
yeah,
Cassady, which I thought was
right.
really strange. I didn't really understand what was going on there, but
What's
whatever.
weird about Kerouac? It's this, like, he was a very firm Catholic, like,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
uh, and he identified as a Catholic. He said, "I'm a Catholic," and
right.
he said that On the Road was about he's a Catholic, and all this other stuff.
Don't you think with Catholics, it's a lot like Jewish people? A lot of the time, it's more of an ethnic identification and not so much like you're not so much saying, I really truly believe in this thing. It's just like, oh, I'm a Catholic. I'm a Jew,
No, well, I mean, it
you
could be, but not for him. He
know?
was adamant. I mean,
But no, he's not
the, the,
living. He's not living any of the tenets of being a Catholic with the things he does, and
I
you
mean,
know,
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. It's not. I can't say whether he does or not. I mean, they've looked at his journals and his diaries, and every day he has like a prayer
that's
uh,
interesting. I didn't
or he
realize
has
that.
a sketch of a crucifix, and this is like every day. I mean, it was
Okay.
always on his mind.
Okay, but
Um,
that's more. But I guess what I'm saying is those are almost like an emotional connection because he's that, and this is right up there. One of the things I was the most surprised about. I knew he was of French Canadian descent. I didn't realize
mhm,
how French Canadian this guy was.
yeah.
I didn't realize that French was his first language, and he was really
Mm,
uncomfortable speaking English, like almost up to the time he was in college.
right.
And I don't know. My read on it is that the Catholic thing for him is an ethnic identification. He's French Canadian, and he's just
Mm,
different. He's different than most of the people around him. Most people are going to be Protestant or in New York Jewish, and so
mm.
he just saw himself as being different than those people. But I don't know. It's interesting you say that about the journals. I don't obviously know anything about that, but
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting way to think about it. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Like Allen Ginsberg, if you asked him, "Are you Jewish?" I'm pretty sure he'd say yes,
Oh, you say
but
yeah, but he didn't
not
practice anything.
religiously
Yeah,
Jewish in any way. I don't
yeah.
think.
I get the sense that he was religiously Catholic. I really do. I really do from his
Did I
interviews and
story? Did I ever tell you the story when I went to Jordan and I went to a university there and they gave us a student ID card
Mhm.
and they said, "What religion are you?" And I was like, like religion's not really a big part of, I'm not really. They were like,
Wrong
"Are you
answer.
They were like, "Are you an atheist?" And I'm like, "No, I just, and they're like, "Are you a Christian or not?" I'm like, "Yes, I guess I'm a Christian." And it dawned on me because I've come from a Protestant background.
Mhm.
The statement "I am a Christian" means I have accepted Jesus Christ as my personal savior and
Mhm.
have been, it's a statement of faith. Whereas
Mhm.
for most people around the world to say, I am a Christian, I am a Jew, I am a Muslim, it's who are you?
Mhm.
Who are your
Yeah,
parents? What's your
yeah.
ethnicity? And so that really,
It's a cultural,
it's a
maybe
cultural, yeah.
regional thing. Maybe, yeah,
And I realized that as a cultural
yeah,
statement, it was
mhm,
100% true. I'm
yeah,
I'm relating to other people here in this country. I'm relating to the people who are Muslim and the people who are Jewish and the people who are Christian differently because of my religious background,
mhm,
despite not being religious, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I guess I kind of learned to see it that way
yeah,
as a marker in that sense, which is very different than I think
yeah.
white Protestant Americans don't think of it that way. You have to
Mhm.
learn to think of it that way from a different context.
Going back to Kerouac and Catholicism, he also decides to be Buddhist for a little while.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
so
remember One of his books, I guess it's probably Dharma Bums, I think is where
Dharma
that
Bums,
becomes the most explicit. There's none of that in this
yeah.
book. I don't think any of that comes across.
No, not yet. He didn't get it. He didn't get into that, and I think until after this was maybe after this was published or before, like between writing it and publishing it, maybe I don't know. But
It's an interesting comparison to make from the things we've read is Catcher in the Rye. That's before this, right?
no, it might have been
Isn't that like
before this was published.
1953?
Yeah, it might have been 52, 53. It might have been published around then.
Yeah.
Yeah, Salinger, but
Because some of the
that
stylistic things that are happening in this book are happening in that book.
yeah.
The way he starts is it's not, like I said, it's not stream of consciousness, but it's very casual in terms of the structure. And it's
So he calls it spontaneous prose. That's
spontaneous
what
prose is what Kerouac calls it. Yeah. And he explicitly links it to Impressionism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, so I had this thought, and this might qualify as my overwrought thinking or theory of the week, but then tell me if this is off base. But I always thought that the Impressionists existed because of the photograph, right?
Mm-hmm.
People invented the photograph, and so it no longer became necessary for a painter to reproduce reality as closely as they possibly could to what it really looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So it created this like psychological space and this necessity for something different, and that Impressionism answered that call. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking about, okay, so if this is spontaneous prose and he's talking about it like it's Impressionism, what would have happened technologically to make that necessary? And I thought about it and I realized it's not about the writing, it's about jazz. And jazz develops because suddenly you've got records and you can have a perfect fidelity copy of what somebody did in music. So you no longer have to create this formula of being able to reproduce the music. So jazz kind of answers that call. Mm-hmm. And this book, the style of prose, is directly inspired by jazz. I don't really think anything changed in the technology of writing, but maybe the typewriter, I guess. You're not doing it long.
So I was thinking that too. And just, since we stay on the book, one of some critical approaches or views of this book is that it reflects the jazz influence. Like that's been an influence. Right. And so I was thinking about that too. And I was what I thought about was sort of different than what you're thinking of. So if you get a jazz record, the thing about it is it's always the same, and there is a formulaic sort of methodology to it. However, more freeform jazz or live jazz, which is what they like doing, they riff off of each other, right? Oh, and a whole song could be unplanned. It's this sort of spontaneous. It's a spontaneous event. If you see jazz live by not a big band of jazz, but by three instruments on stage, and they're feeding off each other, and that's sort of where I saw it when he talks about spontaneous prose. It just sort of goes along, like the story just sort of envelops, right?
The description of what you're saying about jazz is it's like a conversation.
Right.
It's like we all have a part to play. There's 5 of us up here and we're all having a conversation, but we all have to pick up on subtle cues about when it's somebody else's turn to be part of the conversation and to talk for a bit. And if they talk too much, it's obnoxious. And if they don't, then you need to let that guy have his chance to talk. And there's that part where there's that kid in the book who wants to play with the jazz band. Yeah. The jazz band, I think it's in Chicago, and there's a kid following it around. And they just won't let him be part of it. They just won't let him. And there's another one where a white guy gets on stage and tries to drum in the middle of the jazz band. It's the same thing. It's like, you're not part of this conversation. Right, this is an A and B conversation. You can see your way out.
Right.
You don't want anything to do with the guy. I thought it was very similar. I guess a book's not really a conversation, but it's like your part in the conversation, I guess. It's spontaneous. I guess it's sort of like what we're doing right now. It's like, I'm glad there's no structure to this. Well, it's very similar because occasionally while we're doing a show, I'll be talking like I am right now, and I'll be like, I should shut up. I've been talking too long. It's time for Clint to say something. You interrupt somebody because you have a beautiful, wonderful.
Well, it is a conversation after all, right?
So, right. Exactly. So
Kerouac in Denver. So there was a great bar in lower downtown called Lodo, Denver. It was called El Chapultepec, or the Peck, as people there like to call it. The Peck opened in 1990.
What was it called?
It was called El Chapultepec.
Oh, okay. Chapultepec, like
correct. But I think they called it Chapultepec versus Chapultepec, or maybe they called it Chapultepec. And
I have no idea. I'm not saying that's correct.
They called it one. They called it one or the other. But you're right. It's from Mexico, from the town of Mexico. But everybody calls it the Peck. Opened in 1933, right after Prohibition, and they boasted, I think, number one or number two liquor license in the state, maybe number two.
In the state of Colorado?
In the state of Colorado, yeah.
Oh, that's weird.
Because they opened, like I said, in December of 33.
Oh, because the liquor licenses, you didn't have liquor licenses until after Prohibition.
Correct.
Okay, got it. I got it.
And
there would have been bars in Colorado before that, but not.
Yes, right. And so, but it was like a Mexican cantina type place.
Interesting.
Downtown Denver was filled. It was pretty rough, working class or just generally rough. And the reason this place had that name was they would cash the checks for migrant workers and send them down to that place. So everybody called it that, based on the city in Mexico.
Where all the remittances were going, people were sending there. Yeah, that's interesting.
So in the late 1940s, early 1950s, a gentleman married into the family. His wife's dad owned this bar, and he started, I think it was Gary Krantz was the guy's name. He started managing the bar for his father-in-law. And in like 51, 52, thereabouts, he started bringing in jazz because he liked jazz. So he started bringing in jazz bands. And this young man, he's a good-looking guy, but kind of smelly, group of guys would come in. It says and he showed me the first table, and they would never order anything because they didn't have any money. But you didn't have to pay cover. You didn't have to pay cover to listen to jazz. So they'd come in and just listen to jazz for free. And he said they'd go in the parking lot and do drugs, like smoke pot and stuff like that. And it was Kerouac and Cassidy and his whole crew. So that was one of the two hangouts that we sort of covered in the book. Now that one's gone now. But the other place, if anybody's listening wants to go, if you're in Denver, there's a place called My Brother's Bar.
I've been that's the one I've been to. I went to a jazz bar in downtown Denver, and it must have been that because I don't remember Chapultepec. I would remember that.
Well, My Brother's Bar was not jazz. It wasn't in downtown. It was sort of in the downtown area, but it was a super old bar. It's actually the oldest bar in the city. It's still there.
That's the place I went. When I say downtown, I'm using it completely. I really don't know the geography of the city very well.
It's an old.
It was in the actual
bar.
city of Denver, is what I mean.
Yeah, old bar. That place, it's on the map because of the connection with Cassidy. When Cassidy was in jail, one of the times he was in jail, they have a letter that asks a friend of his that he sent this letter to, hey, can you go to this address, which is the address of My Brother's Bar? It was called something different then. Can you go to this address and pay my $2 bar tab so that they don't revoke my tab privileges, so that when I get out, I'll still be able to have a bar tab and be able to go there. And I don't know if the guy actually paid it or not, but the letter exists. So I mean, that was one of Cassidy's haunts, at least. And Kerouac probably, he would have taken Kerouac there as well. So
that's good. I'd like to go and I would love to do an on the road tour of Denver. Because I've been to a lot of these other places. I know San Francisco. I've been there, and I've gone to all kinds of cool places. Obviously, New York. Sorry for the abrupt ending, but that's it for episode 86 of Toasting the Classics. If we ever do a two-part again, we'll learn to work on our transitions. For those playing along at home, put aside another serving of those rusty nails for the second half and our discussion on whether this book is a classic. If you'd like to get in touch, please send us an email at toastingtheclassics@gmail.com. Send us show ideas, comments, complaints, and any screeds written in spontaneous prose detailing your love life. Maybe don't do that. Check out my blog at theattractivenuisance.com and follow us on Twitter at @ractivenuisance. Our music was written by Michelle McArthur. See you next time on Toasting the Classics.